All right. Good morning, everybody, and happy Monday. I'm super excited to kick off the 2023 season of Data is Love with Holly, who is experts in all things DEI data, measurement, people analytics, so many things. Will you just start with telling everybody a little bit about you? And how did you get here? How did you get to this place of specializing in something so niche?
Yeah, so Hallie Bregman, excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I where do I begin? Right now, I am the CEO and founder of the Bregman Group. So, what I do is help companies measure what matters using a data driven approach to DEI and other aspects of employee experience. I've been working in this space for, I don't know, 6, 7 years, but my career has always kind of peripherally centered around both data and equity, inclusion, and underrepresented groups. I can go all the way back to my undergrad days when I took a women's studies course as an elective my first semester and fell in love, and from there it was history. But I got into people analytics formally 5 or 6 years ago when I was doing work at an organization that just really had a great culture of internal mobility. And I was in data science, I was in marketing, and I was like, what else can I do? I care about the people, care about the experience. I had a pretty good pulse on the inclusion, how folks were feeling about the organization, and so I had this opportunity to join the people analytics team, and the rest is history.
And the rest is history. You have one of the best kind of like LinkedIn feeds. Yeah. And so anybody watching today, I so recommend following and connecting because there are always these like little gems, little nuggets that I'm like, oh yeah, I actually hadn't thought of that myself. Why do companies need a measurement strategy for DEI? Why not just do employee resource groups and all kinds of celebrations and trainings?
Yeah.
Why a measurement strategy?
I mean, I could talk all day about this, and I have a million stories, so I'll just share a couple. But we live in an age of data, right? There's no two ways about it, and that means a few things. One, boards and executive teams speak in data, right? And I start here because I think this is the most operational way to talk about this, right? But the reality is, in order to get continued resources into our functions and to continue to do all of the good work in the DEI space that we have been, vehemently doing for years and years, but especially over the last 2 or 3 years, we need to speak their language. Now, I wish this wasn't the case, but we do, and boards and executives talk data. So that is something they understand, which means there's a good influx and return on our work. Secondly, there is so much progress being made, and yet we don't have a way to quantify it. So one of the things I talk about is, with the limited resources that exist within DEI teams, right, within DEI functions, we have to be able to focus. We have to decide where our biggest impact is going to be. And historically, there's a variety of traditional things that people start with, right? ERGs, celebrations, leadership trainings, maybe some recruiting efforts. And the question is, are those things working? One, and are they the right things to start with? And so I always say measurement gives you this opportunity to, one, take a look at your landscape, look at some of the biggest inequities in your data, not in your policies and procedures, right? I think that's part of the larger assessment, but very specifically in your data, and say, oh, that gap is bigger here than it was here. Let's start here, right? And then be able to actually quantify and track, are things changing now that you're doing a program? So a story I was just talking to someone about, and I just loved this story. He wanted to do a program to increase, BIPOC women in leadership. And he did this analysis and found that actually it wasn't the most senior most women that weren't moving up right? That actually was a pretty healthy funnel. Once you got pretty close to the top, you could get to the top. That was a, that's not the case everywhere, but that was the case in this organization. But he found that this middle gap, right? So you're kind of middle management, those women were not moving on to the next level nearly as much as men or white employees, and those BAPAC employees, right? And so he went to find an organization that could help him do a middle management leadership training. And one of the stories was just so impactful. Went to this company and was like, okay, so I need these, middle managers to go through this training. And they were like, no, we only have executive training. And he was like, no, but my data shows that I need it to focus on middle management. And they were like, well, we only focus on executives, right? And I think this is one of the biggest opportunity areas in space, that we make assumptions, right? We know assumptions have gotten us into a lot of trouble. It's part of why we are here where we are today. But we ourselves make assumptions that there are particular focus areas that will have the most impact, and data can help us actually say, yes, that is true, or no, that is not true. Let's do something different.
Yeah, I feel like one of the areas where I see something similar happening is, in organizations that are otherwise like have a healthy work culture, folks will say, well, too many people of color are leaving the organization. And when you look at the data, the attrition is comparable, between white and non-white employees. And of course, because non-white employees are usually a smaller, more visible segment, the perception is they're leaving more often. And that assumption creates all kinds of issues with morale, with like a sense of belonging for the people that do remain. And it can be pretty powerful, I think, just to debunk that.
Yep.
Those kinds of things.
It's so frequently the perception and not the reality of things, right? There's a lot of reality, but
Yeah.
the perception can be dangerous because we have made assumptions about what we perceive. So we perceive there to be pay inequity. We perceive there to be, a difference in retention rates. And sometimes those aren't the problem areas, right? There are many other problem areas. Or they are problem areas, but they're smaller problem areas, right? Those are also things like we can acknowledge that we can say just about everything is a problem area, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But where do we make the biggest impact right now?
Yeah, where do we make the biggest impact right now? I'm curious, in your time doing this work, which is like a pretty significant amount of time, where let me like I'm thinking about like how do I really ask this so it doesn't sound like a leading question. Um, how do you use data to get people to either focus or refocus in the areas where they're going to have the biggest impact, and not the traditional things that folks are talking about in Forbes and HBR, right? We've talked about this, right? There's a big influencer culture around DE&I,
Yep.
and it's hard to know what's right for my company.
Yep. It's always hard to know what's right for your company, but this is a really nascent state, like a nascent area of DEI. So one, DEI as a field, as a dedicated field that most companies have, is only a few years old, right? And then most of those companies have not yet been using data or not beyond headcount, right? I think most organizations will say, well, yes, we're tracking. And like, yes, you're tracking headcount and representation, and that's important, but that is just barely the tip of the iceberg. And so thinking about where to start and kind of like, how do I even influence with this in the first place? I think the first thing is just start, right? Because most people aren't at a sophisticated place where they're doing all kinds of really interesting and complex analysis in order to give us more direction. One of the first things I did when I stepped into my first DEI analytics role was I called it my gap analysis, right? And I just took all of the data we already had. I didn't collect new data. I didn't go on an expedition to do lots of other things. I will say we'd had already a pretty robust self-identification campaign. So I had pretty good data on how folks were identifying. So that is the one piece that really does have to come first in order to do this work. But I took all of that data and I standardized it and I structured it, and I won't use a whole bunch of crazy measurement terms here, but I compared it, right? And I was able to say, wow, this story is compelling about inequity in this particular dimension. And when I took that to the executive leadership team, it was that very specific data point that this was the biggest inequity that, raised alarm bells and ultimately led to hiring the very first head of DEI in this organization. So in this particular case, the analytics came first, which is so rare. But the analytics came first, and that actually justified the work. And the work, therefore, that came after was very specifically focused, at least in one area, on this particular dimension, which we knew had the biggest gap. And so sometimes I say, like, just take what you have. You don't have to do belonging surveys. You don't have to start with complex, additional campaigns. Just every organization has a system of record, an HRIS, applicant tracking system, right? Those systems already have lots of rich data. Let's just take a look at the landscape.
Okay, I want to maybe go in the weeds a little bit around I have two questions. One, at what org size does it make sense to have a measurement practice? And my second question, you said this organization had already done a self-ID campaign. And at what point in the maturity of, like your DE&I data practice, do you do a self-ID campaign?
Okay, I'm going to start with the second question first, and then you'll probably.
And what is a self-ID campaign for anybody that's listening that doesn't know what that means?
Okay, so self-identification campaign means asking your employees to identify themselves, right? And typically, that may be something along the lines of race and gender. Those are EEOC mandated fields, and so for public companies, they are actually required to identify everybody in their organization and disclose those numbers. And so that is where most companies start. But a lot of companies have started to go further. One, modifying those two questions. So, for instance, the government form of gender is binary, male, female. So most organizations now have some assessment of gender identity, be it gender non-binary. Oftentimes they have a transgender attribute as well. Ethnicity, the same. There's the government form that saying lumps Asian all into one giant, massive, huge bucket. We know there are many different countries in Asia. They are not all the same. So you can certainly break that out, and some organizations are starting to do that. Organizations also will ask things like sexual orientation, caregiver status, marital status, religion. There's a number of different attributes that you can ask employees to self-identify on. And so that really is just foundational work in order to be able to look at differences. If I don't know who is Black or white, I cannot look at the data and compare, say, the retention rate for those who are Black versus the retention rate for those who are white. So at a minimum, I need folks to self-identify. And most organizations at this point still have just gender and race. But start there. So it's why most organizations are reporting on gender and race, because that's all they've collected.
Yeah. How many categories would you collect data on?
Yeah.
If somebody, how do you know what are going to be the most important ones for any particular organization?
Yeah. So one of the questions you started with was, how big should you be when you start doing this? There's no minimum, right? Start early. The earlier you start, the better, because then you have history. And history can be really valuable as you grow and scale. So you could be 5 people and you could be collecting this data, right? There's different analyses you can do it at different sizes, but in terms of a self-identification campaign, there is no minimum threshold. Do it ASAP. In terms of categorization and how granular you get, I always think there's some trade-offs here. On the granular side, so saying let's say you get more detailed and you talk about pansexual, or you talk about Japanese American or something along those lines. There's a way to help employees feel seen, right? If I've bucketed you into Asian, right, do you feel seen as an Asian? Some people might say, sure, yeah, I feel seen, I'm good. Or I'm used to this. It always buckets me in it, right? And some people might say, well, actually, I'm from this very specific region, and it's very important to me that this is represented in my identity. And
Mm-hmm.
so the benefit of kind of getting more granular certainly is helping folks see themselves in the data. The tricky part is from an analysis perspective, right? You, by definition, this is a hard space because underrepresented means less of, right? And so by definition, there are fewer, maybe not to come, but in most identities,
Mm-hmm.
fewer than white people, right? And so
Yeah.
when you do an analysis of 100 white people, you might have 2, 3, 4 people of color included in that. And 2, 3, 4 is not going to give you any statistical validity in terms of size, right? So you might lump them all together and say, this is, historically marginalized, underrepresented folks of any kind. And these are white people. There are different ways to do that. I think having the granularity means you can always break it out more, but you can also always aggregate it up. So my
Mm-hmm.
recommendation is to go as granular as you need. And I always work with ERGs or employees in the organization to help decide what are the right buckets here, kind of get buy-in from the folks. I don't need to decide myself. I'm a white woman. I don't need to decide how you are going to classify yourself, and put those, in a way that folks feel seen. And then on the back end of the analysis, I have that flexibility to go granular, to go, more aggregate. And as the organization grows, get there. So it's definitely, there's two sides to every coin, but I really err on the side of helping folks feel seen.
And it sounds like you love self ID campaigns. You love, like, you got so excited. You're like, self ID? Yes. Let's figure out all the things. Um, One of the questions in the chat is like, how do you portray the why for collecting, let's say, sensitive data? And I think for me, there's a layer of the political landscape, not just in the United States, but in many, many countries in the world, including where I come from, India, right, where disclosing that puts you at risk because you don't know what your employer is going to do with it. And so yeah, what's the appropriate path to
Yep.
collecting this information and the why for it, and also I guess employee safety. I mean,
Yep. I mean, this is another tricky question, and it in some ways comes down to regulation. So this work, DEI data, has happened much more in a US centric manner because of the lack of regulation, if you will, in the US. Some might say that's a tough thing. I myself feel actually quite positive about it because you don't know what you don't measure, right? And so if we don't
that's
measure,
right.
if we can't look at this, we cannot
Mm-hmm.
say that we're impacting any change. We cannot say we're making things better. We can do the work, but we can't quantify
Yeah.
the impact. And I think that is just such a critical part of our message, and saying that DEI is important. It works. It needs to be maintained. It needs to be invested in. And it shouldn't be, the first on the chopping block when layoffs come. So we need to quantify that impact, and that's incredibly important. So I myself am also pretty risk tolerant. Those more risk averse may disagree with me, but I say let's collect it all, right? And the why is exactly what I just said, to quantify and demonstrate impact. Again, so GDPR is the regulation in Europe, and GDPR says you must have a very clear-cut business reason for collecting any particular data point. It must be completely voluntary. Consent must be, obtained. And there are also some very specific restrictions about deleting data. So if I decided to give you my sexual identity and then I didn't want you to have it anymore, you have to be able to delete it, right? So that you cannot infer that
Mm-hmm.
Allie now is whatever identity I disclosed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that regulation makes it much more challenging to do this work in Europe. Gender is about the only thing you're allowed to collect objectively. And so a lot of folks take the approach of collecting the data in the US, doing some of the analysis, demonstrating the impact in the US, and then being able to justify doing the work abroad where you now have business impact to prove out your point. Safety is a whole nother challenge. And I think that's where privacy, huge role of privacy is in play. And I could go on for days about it, but it's just absolutely one of the most critical pieces to the work that we do. And that both means like, personal privacy, but also the integrity and privacy of the data, making sure we've protected it and that it doesn't get into the wrong hands.
Yeah, I feel like we need a webinar, a seminar, a day-long conference on safety and privacy. I think especially in the US where like women are wondering, like, is my doctor's note going to be forwarded on to somebody else? Right? If that's what I need to submit to justify 4 days in a row of absence. Yeah. Okay. We have a couple more questions in the chat just around what's the best way, and I think this will be the last question on self-ID, but is the best way to collect it during the HRIS, during onboarding? Yeah.
So generally it requires a one-time campaign across all existing employees. And then yes, onboarding going forward. So you keep that up to date. My preference is to use, yes, an HRIS as opposed to a survey. A lot of surveys will have kind of templates to collect this. My preference is an HRIS because one of the security of the information, that system is pretty locked down. It's pretty complex with user roles already. And two, an employee can go in and update it at any time, unlike a survey, which happens at a point in time. So if I become a caregiver or I change my identity, I go through some gender reaffirming surgery, right? I can go in and update that at any time. And so that again is kind of like my identity is a real-time thing. It can change. And so that's another reason why I like an HRIS approach.
I guess I'm curious, like when might you not use the HRIS?
Yeah. I mean, it's a footprint, right? And so there is a point of view that anonymous data collection can be preferable, right? Because if it is not tied to you, we can still get a representative view of what proportion of the organization is made up of folks who identify as male versus female versus non-binary versus, black, white, etc. And you don't need somebody attached to that piece of information. That typically only works for representation, though. Only for headcount can you collect anonymous data, where it is not tied to you, and then a survey would suffice. But then you cannot tie that information back to other systems. When you talk about something like retention or hiring, I can't look at it now, right? Because it's not tied to your other attributes. It's just a data point in a survey. So, it's some folks prefer to get started with a survey before they kind of hard code it into their system of record. My strong preference is just about never to use a survey.
Okay. Yes. We are actually going through a really similar challenge, not with respect to employee demographic information, but when it's anonymous, the biggest drawback is I can't tie it to anything else. You're not your salary, not your start date, not how often you've been promoted, none of it. Okay, we only have a couple more minutes. So let's say I'm at a company, I'm a DE&I practitioner or a consultant, and I'm working with a company that's ready to make its kind of like first hire in the measurement space, or right, maybe I'm going to second somebody from the HR team or from another part of the organization. what are the skills for this very first person I'm going to hire? I've never done it. What's the basic
Well,
hard skills, soft skills?
yeah, I think before we go into skills, I just want to share kind of the options for doing this, right? I think
Oh,
there are organizations that have people analytics teams that leverage them.
mhm.
They're not dedicated to DEI, but they, are kind of experts in all of the employee data. We know DEI expands beyond the employee. Certainly, my expertise in
Right?
what we've talked about here is mostly around employees. And so that team, can be leveraged. One of the challenges with that team, and so again, those are folks with data skills. They're used to being in the data. They might be less DEI experts, but they're pretty adept at the employee profile. They have many other responsibilities as well, right? They are supporting many different areas of the business and of the employee life cycle, DEI being one of them. And that means that there isn't always capacity to do the work you'd like to do.
Yeah.
The second option is to have a DEI measurement specialist on staff. That can be great, right? That means that you have somebody who is got strong expertise in DEI and in analytics. Generally, you want somebody, people will be like, I need a data scientist to do this work? And I always say, what is a data scientist? First of all, that is a hard thing to define in the first place. But you don't need somebody with like crazy hard machine learning coding skills, right? You need somebody who can do, um, you know, the basic analysis. And you can get a little bit more sophisticated, but to start, it's, somebody who can run pivot tables in Excel. I hate Excel and pivot tables. I do all of my coding in Python, but you don't need somebody who can do all of their coding in Python, not to start. But you need somebody who can connect with the people. You need somebody that folks can look to and trust, that they're using their data appropriately, right? That only means you're going to get more buy-in from your employee base because they know that I, Hallie, am a trustworthy person. I have relationships with them, and therefore they are more comfortable with me. The limitation to that is now I'm a silo, which we know is a big challenge in DEI work in general, right? When you have a DEI team, they own DEI for your organization, which means you can point the finger at them when something doesn't go right, and you can point the finger at them when work needs to get done. And this should be co-owned by an entire organization. So one of the challenges with pulling it out is that you've now separated it. And then the third approach is to use a consultant, right? And so one of the things I do is come in to organizations and help them build a measurement strategy, help them build the infrastructure to track it. And then with that foundation, they can lean on some general people analytics folks to kind of go forward. But they have that really robust thought component up front. So, certainly analytics are part of it. Hard skills are part of it. I don't like to call them soft skills. I like to call them power skills. Thank you, Josh Burson. But the power skills, right? I think you need people in this role or in this field that can form relationships, can build trust, have that presence and authenticity. And I think transparency is a big part of it, right? If you've got folks doing this work who are major secret keepers. Now we know there's like some legal risks and some privacy things, right, that all have to be respected. And I'm going to be real. And I think that's a way to build trust and an important part of somebody doing this work.
Okay, so speaking of transparency, last question. Best practice or the right thing to do, how much do you share internally and how much do you share externally? And now that I asked that question, anything that you share internally is just up for grabs, right? Because of the world that we live in today. It's just so easy to post things on Reddit or anywhere else. Yeah, what do you share? How much do you share? And
Yeah.
how do you and like what are you sort of advising um to your own clients in terms of balancing impact and liability?
Yeah. Oh, this is such a hard one. And I'm actually writing some content on this right now because it's right. I personally, right, me, Hadley Bregman, not a representative of my organization, not right. I'll tell you everything, right? That's not the right approach at an organization, and I'll tell you why. Um, there are things that everyone should know and can know for their own, you know, um, you know, knowledge, protection, ability to advocate for themselves. And there are things that you just can't share due to legal liability, um, due to identifying, outing others and their identities. Um, there are phenomena that are not, like uh, cannot be impacted right bottom up. And many things can, and I'm a big fan of kind of grassroots efforts here. But I think it is a delicate balance, and it's also about making sure that people have enough information, but not too much information to do harm. So, an example: when you fill out a employee engagement survey or belonging survey, right? The platforms that do this are really, really clear that you have a minimum threshold before you can access the responses from that team, right? So normally it's a threshold of 5. You have to have at least 5 responses from your direct reports in order to be able to look at those results. Now, if you could split that 5 by men versus women or by people of color versus white people, let's say you have one person of color and you split it 4 and 1. Nope, problem, right? I now know the one person
Exactly who that is.
right? And so you might
Yeah.
say, but I want to know, like, I got to be able to know the trends. And to which we'd say, nope, there have to be 5 people in every bucket before you can split it. So if there's 5 white people and 1 person of color, nope, can't split it, right? Because if I get the 5, then I can still figure out the last one. So there's a lot of these kinds of things that, we have to think very delicately about what to say, what not to say, what to share. Certainly representation, I think at this point is a given. You should be sharing representation within your company for all attributes folks have self-identified on.
Okay, so my takeaway from all the things that you just shared is, what are the things that cannot be impacted bottom up? And I don't know that I've actually ever thought of it that way. Because I tend to also be like, yeah, share everything, like, yeah, mitigate risk a little bit, but share as much as you possibly can. But it's like, share things that are actionable. And there's a whole world of things that most employees, it's not useful, right? It either creates mistrust, or it lowers morale, and that's probably not worth sharing. um I feel like I can talk to you every time I talk to you. I feel like I can talk to you for hours and hours and hours and just like pull all of the wisdom out of your head. If folks want to be in touch with you, what's the best way?
Yeah, LinkedIn. I am a LinkedIn junkie. I am there all the time. I post quite frequently, but I'm always more than happy to connect and chat and interact. So please find me there, and then you can definitely find me at my website or my email, Hallie at thebregmangroup.co. So feel free to reach out that way as well.
Okay, thank you so
Thank
much for being my very first guest in this new year, and the new sort of series for Data is Love. Really grateful for all of the nuggets that you shared today, and I hope that you'll say yes to coming back at another future time where we can dive into, like, I don't know, it sounds like self ID campaigns
you.
is something that people are really keen on. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. Have a great week ahead, folks.
Thanks all.